For 111 years, the story has been frozen in time and in ice. We all see it in our mind's eye. The black, mirrored surface of the North Atlantic, the final, desperate flares, and then the image, the stern of the RMS Titanic, a 46,000-ton behemoth rising against a star-filled sky, its massive propellers clawing at the air. We hear the sound, a sound survivors could only describe as a giant tearing calico or the roar of 1,000 cannons. And then, the snap. The unsinkable ship, the floating palace that symbolized the zenith of the industrial age, cracks, breaks, and tears itself in two, beginning its final 2.5-mile plunge into the abyss. This single moment, immortalized in James Cameron's 1997 epic, has defined the disaster for generations. But was it accurate? For a century, the how and why of that breakup has been the single most debated part of the tragedy. Survivors' accounts were famously wildly conflicting. Some, like Colonel Archibald Gracie, swore she sank intact. Others, like wireless operator Harold Bride, insisted she broke apart. The physics of it seemed to defy belief. How could a ship built of the finest steel, with a double-bottom hull and 16 advanced watertight compartments, a ship that was the pride of the White Star Line, be ripped asunder like a child's toy? We knew the what, the iceberg. We knew the where, the North Atlantic. We never truly knew the why. Why did she break? And why did she break like that? The violent, catastrophic moment of the 20th century's most famous disaster has remained its most enduring mystery. Until now. The debate is over. This is not another grainy, green-hued video from a submersible's flickering headlights. This is the first ever, full-scale, centimeter-perfect 3D digital scan of the entire wreck site. A digital twin of the Titanic, created by deep-sea mapping company Magellan. This isn't a peek through a porthole, it's the whole picture. Using 700,000 high-resolution images and 16 terabytes of data, they have created a perfect, explorable 3D model of the 3-mile debris field. For the first time, we are not just looking at a ghost. We are examining a crime scene in full, horrifying detail. And the evidence this digital twin has finally revealed solves the mystery, pointing to a fatal flaw that was hiding in plain sight from the day she was built.
To comprehend this discovery, you must first comprehend the darkness. The Titanic rests at 12,500 feet. The pressure is over 6,000 pounds per square inch. There is no light. Not a single photon from the sun has ever reached this place. It is an environment more hostile than space. For decades, exploring it meant strapping into a cramped submersible, descending for over 2 hours, and shining powerful lights that could only illuminate a tiny cone of vision. It was, as one explorer said, like trying to understand New York City at midnight during a blizzard using only a dim flashlight. You could see a fire hydrant, you could see a doorway, you could never, ever see the whole building, let alone the entire city. The Magellan project changed everything. For over 200 hours, 2 autonomous underwater vehicles, nicknamed Romeo and Juliet, scanned the wreck site. They weren't tethered. They were flying pre-programmed grids using a technique called photogrammetry. They didn't just look at the wreck, they measured it, taking 700,000 images that, when stitched together by a supercomputer, created a model so precise, so real, it is difficult to look at. The result is breathtaking. and profoundly chilling. We can now fly around the entire wreck as if the water itself has been drained away. We see the majestic bow, still instantly recognizable, its hull covered in a carpet of rusticles. We can see the name Titanic, still faintly visible. We can see the serial number 401 on the blades of the portside propeller. But the scan also gives us context. We see the bow is buried 60 feet deep in the mud, crumpled from its high-speed impact with the ocean floor. Then we fly over half a mile across the Hell's Kitchen of the debris field. This is where the story of the breakup is written. We see the ship's massive boilers torn free from their foundations. We see twisted metal from the grand staircase, elegant deck benches, unopened champagne bottles, and the heartbreakingly human-scale artifacts. Pairs of shoes lying in the silt, the only marker of a victim long since returned to the elements. And then we arrive at the stern. It is not a ship. It is a war zone. A catastrophic ruin of twisted, mangled, and pulverized steel, which collapsed in on itself as it plunged downwards. For the first time, we can see the exact jagged line where the ship was torn apart. We can trace the path of destruction. The 3D scan allows researchers to reassemble this giant, tragic puzzle. And in doing so, they have been able to forensically deconstruct the sinking, second by second. This model proves that the failure was far more violent, far more complex, and far more rapid than any of us, even James Cameron, ever imagined.
For a century, we've had theories. We blamed the materials, we blamed the builders. The first and most popular theory was the steel. In the 1990s, samples brought up from the wreck were tested. They were found to have a high content of sulfur, making them more brittle in the freezing -2 degrees Celsius water than modern steel. The theory was that the Titanic's hull didn't bend on impact with the iceberg. It shattered like glass. This theory was compelling, but the 3D scan challenges it. The scan shows the iceberg damage was a series of long, thin gashes and punctures, not a giant 300-foot gaping hole. The hull plating did bend in part. It didn't just explode. The brittle steel was a factor, but it was not the smoking gun. Then came the theory of the rivets. Researchers argued that Hartland and Wolff, under pressure to build 3 massive Olympic-class liners at once, cut corners. They used lower quality number 3 iron rivets in the bow and stern instead of the stronger number 4 steel rivets used in the high-stress central body. The theory was that these weaker, slag-filled rivets popped their heads, allowing the hull plates to separate like a zipper. This, too, was a major contributing factor to the flooding. It explains why the iceberg damage was so extensive, but it does not explain the breakup. The ship didn't break where the rivets were weakest. It broke where the ship as a whole was strongest. The new 3D scan, combined with advanced new physics simulations, finally points the finger at the real culprit. It's not the materials, it's the design. The smoking gun is a feature that was, ironically, designed to make the ship the most comfortable liner in the world. The culprit is the ship's aft expansion joint. What is an expansion joint? On a ship of this unprecedented size, at 882.5 feet, she was the largest moving object ever built by man. The designers had to account for basic physics. In rough seas, a long, rigid steel hull will flex. It hogs, bends up in the middle, and sags, bends down. To prevent the upper decks, the superstructure, from cracking under this stress, they built in 2 massive expansion joints. You can see them in old photographs, a tar-filled gap, about an inch wide, cutting clean across the ship's upper decks, including the first-class promenade.
By their very nature, these joints were the weakest structural point on the upper half of the ship. They were a perforated edge, a tear-here line built directly into the Titanic's design. When the iceberg opened the first 5, then 6 compartments to the sea, the bow began its inexorable tilt downwards. It filled with 40,000 tons of water. This, in turn, lifted the massive stern clear out of the ocean. This created a bending moment, a point of leverage and stress that no engineer in 1912 had ever conceived of. And where was that stress concentrated like a laser beam? Precisely on the weakest part of the upper structure, the aft expansion joint. The 3D model, by showing the exact angle of the torn steel and the peeling damage on the upper decks, proves what scientists long suspected but could never prove. The break did not start from the bottom, from the keel, ripping upwards. It started from the top. The expansion joint unzipped the ship from the top down, like tearing a piece of cardboard. Once that joint failed, the entire structural integrity of the unsinkable ship was gone. The designers had created a masterpiece, but they had also, unwittingly, engineered its precise point of failure.
The Hollywood version is slow and agonizing. The stern rises to 45 degrees, maybe more, hanging there for minutes as the band plays on. The new simulations, fed with the precise real-world data from the Magellan 3D twin, paint a much different and far more terrifying picture. The failure was not slow, it was catastrophic, explosive, and almost instantaneous. The AI-powered simulation, which can run thousands of scenarios, found the tipping point. It was not at 45 degrees. The failure began when the ship's tilt reached just 15 to 20 degrees. At this angle, the stress on the upper decks became too much. The aft expansion joint failed. We're not talking about a slow groan. We are talking about the sound of a pistol shot as the first steel plates ruptured. Within seconds, the entire superstructure was unzipping. The hull girder, the massive spine of the ship at its keel, was now taking on a load it was never designed to bear alone. It snapped. The entire event, from the first unzipping of the expansion joint to the stern tearing completely free, likely took less than a minute. This explains the roar the survivors heard. It was the sound of a 900-foot-long mountain of steel being torn in half by the fundamental laws of physics. This new timeline also solves other mysteries. It explains the conflicting survivor accounts. It happened so fast, in such total darkness, that what you saw depended entirely on where you were. It also explains the state of the wreck. The stern didn't just plunge. As it ripped away, it was flooded with thousands of tons of water in an instant. This caused a violent, catastrophic implosion as it corkscrewed towards the seabed. This is why the stern is a mangled, pulverized ruin, while the bow, which sank largely intact, is in relatively good condition. The 3D scan provides the final piece of forensic evidence. When we fly over the bow section, we can clearly see the accordion damage. As the water-filled bow hit the ocean floor at over 30 miles per hour, its double-bottom hull, the very feature designed to keep it safe, crumpled and folded in on itself like a paper fan. This damage pattern, now visible for the first time, proves the bow section was already critically damaged and structurally weakened by the unimaginable stresses of the breakup before it even began its final 2.5-mile descent. But this new, cold, hard evidence forces us to ask a more human question. What about Thomas Andrews, the ship's brilliant designer, the chief architect from Harland and Wolff? A man so beloved, he was traveling in first class, but spent most of the voyage in the bowels of the ship with the engineers, taking meticulous notes on how to improve his creation. He was, famously, the one who did the calculations.
He was the one who told Captain Smith they had but an hour or two before she foundered. And he was the one who was last seen staring at a painting in the first-class smoking room, having accepted his fate. Did he know? In those final hours, did he realize that his own design, his masterpiece, contained the seeds of its own destruction? The answer is almost certainly no. The expansion joints were not a mistake. They were a standard, accepted, and necessary piece of engineering for a ship of that size. The Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, had them and served for 24 years without incident. These joints were stress-tested for ocean swells, for the normal, predictable life of a transatlantic liner. They were never, ever designed to withstand the stress of the entire stern half of the ship being lifted 100 feet into the air by the bow. This wasn't a story of negligence. It was a story of hubris, a failure of imagination by an entire generation of engineers. The technology of the era, the very slide rules and logarithmic tables they used, could not simulate or predict the physics of such an unprecedented, multi-compartment failure. In fact, the paradox is that it was Andrew's greatest safety feature, the watertight compartments, that caused the unique bow-down angle of sinking that led to the breakup. If the ship had flooded evenly, she would have settled, and likely stayed afloat for many more hours, perhaps long enough for the Carpathia to arrive. In those final quiet moments, Thomas Andrews wasn't just a man waiting to die. He was, perhaps, the only person on Earth who understood the full extent of the cascading engineering failure happening all around him. He wasn't just a victim of an iceberg. He was a victim of the limits of his own brilliant, but tragically human imagination. The 3D scan proves that the ship was doomed not just by the ice, but by the limits of its own time. The design flaw was hiding in plain sight, a tragic what-if that would lie dormant until the night of April 14, 1912, when the ship was pushed far beyond any limit its creators had ever dreamed possible.
The 2023 digital scan of the RMS Titanic is a watershed moment. It has done more than just create a haunting, staggeringly detailed 3D model. It has provided the final, concrete data points needed to solve the ship's last great mystery. It has moved the Titanic from the realm of legend and myth into the cold, clear light of a forensic case study. It has replaced Hollywood spectacle with unblinking scientific truth. The ship did not break apart in a slow, dramatic 45-degree snap. It was explosively unzipped from the top down at a much shallower angle, a failure vector built into its very own superstructure. It was not one single flaw, not just the steel, not just the rivets, but a catastrophic cascade failure initiated by the expansion joint and sealed by the laws of physics. This new evidence finally allows us to understand the true, terrifying, and rapid mechanics of the ship's final moments. The digital twin ensures that while the physical wreck will one day be consumed by the ocean, the truth of its passing and the stories of the 1,500 souls who went with it are now preserved forever in perfect, tragic detail. The Titanic's secrets, held by the crushing darkness for over a century, have finally been brought to the light.